Um, all right. Hi, everybody. I'm Aaron Krickenberger. Today is Thursday, August 16th, and this is the weekly SIG Architecture meeting. This is being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube, so please keep in mind that what you say will be set in stone forever and ever. I'm going to run us through our usual housekeeping, starting by sharing my screen and walking us through the boards that we have set up for this purpose. So we're going to start with the conformance testing review board. And Brian, I'm gathering you had some things you wanted to say about these.
Yes, I did. So first of all, thanks, Aaron, for pushing a bunch of these issues forward. For other folks, just sent out email this morning about conformance testing. We are trying to improve test coverage of important, widely used existing features that are portable and non-optional. And have stable APIs, especially prioritizing cases where the implementation is pluggable or has plugins like the container runtime interface, or where there are demonstrated multiple implementations, right? Since the goal is portability, we want to ensure that all these cases, all these alternate implementations are all compatible for users. So we have been focusing, pod is very under tested, and that's like the most used feature of Kubernetes and has a pretty rich set of functionality. So we have been prioritizing more pod tests in particular. A lot of the pod functionality was tested by node conformance tests, which were not actually part of the conformance suite, despite similarity of the name, because they didn't actually run as part of the same test framework and so on. So I am prioritizing, in terms of my own time in SIG Architecture, I am prioritizing conformance testing in general over things like API reviews. And that's like a general topic I want to get to later. But I reviewed all of the open conformance test PRs that I'm aware of, all the ones that were in the dashboard. If there are ones that were not labeled conformance, area conformance in Kubernetes, and or were not in the dashboard, then I didn't get to them. Please fix both of those things, add the label and file an issue to the architecture tracking repo to tell us to add it to the dashboard. Now, the tests that are many of them, after some discussion, were approved. Some issues that came up were whether we wanted the logs, the pod log API to be tested as part of conformance. I had some concerns about stability, at least in real use in clusters, but I'm convinced that doesn't really apply to conformance, and users would expect that feature to work. Exec also came up. There had been stability problems in the past, but those seem to be resolved, and exec is required to be implemented by all CRI implementations. So exec-based functionality, such as in lifecycle hooks and probes, will be in conformance. The remaining tests that are in review there have some issues. The aggregator tests have are registering a really old API version or release of the API server.
Yeah. So in the interest of expediency here, like I've been keeping track of this.
Okay.
So I haven't had time to like immediately jump on top of these as soon as you've reviewed them. I'm going to get better about that. But I need to find a way to make sure that it seems like what's happening right now is as you're taking a look at tests that people haven't written, they're just getting ported, that you're taking a much more granular look at what is actually happening, and bringing up and sort of iterating on your technical understanding of what conformance means, which is really useful and necessary stuff. I'm trying to figure out how perhaps you and I can iterate more on this, or if there's a way I can find the right subject matter experts to iterate with before taking this to your time.
Yeah, I think another good thing to explore would be how we can get more subject matter area experts involved in the process. So one general thing that would help is to understand what surface area is being tested now.
Right.
And then we can vet whether we're happy with that or not. And
Yeah.
then if any new tests, part of the point is adding new surface area. So I'm not entirely sure how to.
So I have some thoughts on that I'm planning on putting together in a
Okay.
more fully formed presentation to the CNCF Conformance Working Group, because I'd really like to make sure I have buy-in from everybody collectively. But the TLDR is, I think that API coverage is a poor proxy for behavior-based coverage. It will not show us what corner cases look like. I have somebody who's putting together a proposal to do some evil hackery to get us line-based coverage, which will be far more illustrative of which corner cases we are actually catching in pieces of code. It may break certain performance-based thresholds, but I think it will definitely inform the direction we should be going for writing different test cases. So I don't know that it's super necessary to hash that out here, just other than to send a signal out that, like, I really would like to get more active discussion going when it comes time to iterate through, is this conformance, is this not conformance? Right now I'm finding, Brian, you go through the BRs in a batch, 1 hour a week, and then sometimes the discussion gets kicked up to email, is there a better escalation mechanism for this? And I'm looking at the room with Tim Hawken and Daniel Smith and subject matter experts there, because I think all of you have just as much of a voice in what is or is not conformance behavior as Brian and I do.
But Dan Kahn, just wanted to interject that there's absolutely no status quo bias towards the existing tests that we're currently funding. It was much more about trying to get this external dev team up to speed. So I think you'll find us very open to changing direction based on your feedback.
100%, and I really appreciate your flexibility there. We're still at the point where we're trying to build momentum. So I'm just at the point where I need to, you sort of break the work down into what are the corner cases we need to cover, and then what is the most appropriate way of testing out functionality, as Brian is discovering things like logs versus termination messages, or is exec okay, is it not okay? What are the assumptions we can have for storage, blah, 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 blah.
I think it would help if we had a larger pool of subject matter experts to analyze the tests and then kick up questionable issues for discussion.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I'd love to see us, I'm going to suggest, I'm sorry for being late here. Are there places where we see divergent behavior that is not covered by the conformance test, where we might want to tighten stuff down? So instead of actually going and saying, where do we need coverage, we can say, where do we have anecdotal reports where things look like they diverge? And I think one example here, and this one would be very difficult to do with conformance, but maybe it's an aspect of conformance, is when a node disappears with a cloud provider, does the node actually get removed from the server versus not? And we see this being different across cloud providers, and it's something that maybe working with the new cloud SIG, we might be able to tighten down and then write conformance tests about it. That's something that actually does give concrete problems for folks. So I think
have you filed an issue for that?
What's that?
Have you filed an issue for that?
This was a while ago.
There is an issue. It actually got talked about in the August cloud SIG meeting. So that example is a good example. It happens to be getting resolved, but there aren't conformance tests for it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so, sorry to interject there. I have also talked to Andrew from the SIG cloud provider about having the creation and curation of additional conformance tests be part of the runway for onboarding new cloud providers as sub-projects there.
So to be clear, I'm really focused on, let's use the word core, but just the barest minimums of functionality to call something a Kubernetes cluster. I think how a cluster behaves when there is a cloud provider plugged in is kind of a layer above. And I think that's a great set of tests that the cloud provider SIG should own, And then there's some later discussion about profiles that I really don't want to have today, because I really think we just need to focus on core
Aaron,
functionality.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. The purpose of conformance is to make sure that as implementations diverge, we actually get predictable behavior. Now, the end-to-end tests, the purpose of those is to actually ensure that we have a well-working system. Now, we're reusing the end-to-end tests for conformance, but I think it's important to recognize that those really are slightly different purposes across those things. And the places where we're going to see the most issues around conformance are going to be places where we do have pluggability that will be outside of core. So I think conformance around CRI, conformance around CNI, around CSI, around cloud providers, those are the places where if we can start locking things down, even though they're harder to test, I think we're going to provide the most value to users in terms of what conformance means moving forward.
I mostly buy that, except that cloud provider is an optional thing and not required to run a Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, so we can't, I agree it's important to cover, Joe. We'll need a batch of cloud provider oriented functionality in some kind of profile, but we don't have profiles yet. So we need to get moving on that. Bob has had his hand up for a while.
Well, I had my hand up and then Joe started to talk, and my question was, why is ETE and conformance not 100% overlapped? I mean, I think at least practically speaking, most people actually use ETE when they test their systems.
There are a lot of E2E tests of features that don't qualify for conformance because they test alpha or beta features or non-portable features or things like that. So it should be a superset.
Yes.
But the alpha beta, I get the like conformance test can go that there's a release issue. Anyway, all right. It kind of feels to me like the overlap there ought to be a bit stronger.
I think another issue is most of the tests haven't been vetted for the criteria that we're iteratively developing, right? So they test things that aren't actually guaranteed to be stable, for example. Like one test I just looked at was matching an exact value of a reason string, which is not a valid thing to do according to the API definition, right? It's not defined as part of the API. Like the contents of an event that's generated is not part of the API, right? So we had some end-to-end tests. They were testing based on that in the past, and that was a problem for version skew testing as part of the release process, much less conformance. So, over time, I think that would be a good goal, is to have all E2E tests in conformance or in staging areas to be promoted to conformance when they qualified, but we're nowhere near there yet.
I appreciate the context. Thanks.
So, and my point is that I think there is a ton of overlap here, but like if we only have so many tokens to spend on improving these tests, where, and for the purpose of conformance, where are we going to get the most bang for the buck in terms of improving tests? And those are the places where we do have variability, even if it fast forwards us ahead around.
Right. And we are focused on that, Joe. I mean, not the specific issue that you called out, but that is exactly why we're prioritizing the tests that we're prioritizing.
I guess the follow-up there then is, for those that are interested in expanding conformance, should the goal be to first get it accepted into ETE and then get it tagged for conformance?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I really apologize if it's as though I'm a bottleneck. I really need to de-bottleneck myself. But my goal here is we should be focusing on the things that are pluggable and can change. We should be focusing just on end-to-end tests. I expect there's a different level of fidelity for things like CRI, CNI, CSI, cloud providers. You need to have some kind of testing that says this is a valid CRI implementation before you get to the level of a Kubernetes cluster, when using this CRI implementation, behaves in a certified conformant manner. And I'm really just focused on that and leaving it kind of up to the implementations at those interface levels to get some basic level of validation there. Further, the conformance test stock that Jordan linked is a really good start, but I think that needs to be tightened up quite a bit to help start. Like, as Brian is iterating on these real fine-grained technical details about what is and is not acceptable, I want to come up with a super concrete list so it's really clear to both review subject matter experts and people who are potentially writing tests what they can and cannot do, what is and is not considered conformant.
Ken has hands up for like 10 minutes now.
Sorry, go.
No
Ken.
problem.
Sorry, you're too small. I can't see there.
Okay. So I think once the deployment PR merges, have conformance for the workloads API. And we did this effort as part of taking it to V1. One of the things we found is that the big issue was we had a lot of E2E tests that really should have been medium tests. So what we did there was move them into the integration framework and wrote integration tests. We didn't have appropriate small tests. And I really don't think you want to try to get slot coverage for your conformance tests. That's going to be painful. You should probably focus on lines of code coverage in your unit tests. So making sure that each module has appropriate coverage for small, medium, and large tests, and then looking out and saying, okay, well, for my EDE tests, I really want these to be black box and expose system behavior that we care about, that actually defines what it is, and then marking those as conformance. That was like doable in a fixed time frame in order to like get some value out of the process. So
sorry, I'm going to pause right there. Could I get a volunteer to take notes?
I will take notes. I kind of have a tough time talking and noting at the same time.
No, let's get a different volunteer. We have a ton of people on the meeting.
I can do it. This is the.
Thank you.
So doing that made the entire thing less painful. It gave us good coverage. It reduced the flakiness of the entire API surface, and we've had much less breakage in terms of upgrade testing. I think that might be something that would be a goal for the various SIGs that own portions of the API as opposed to.
So yeah, I have a comment on that. So somewhere I have a list of test issues, and that's one of the major issues, is that really to get better test coverage and more stable testing and more efficient testing and so on, there are lots of reasons why having more narrowly scoped tests are desirable. You know, they're easier to debug and so on. So, but the challenge is we also want to make sure that user-facing features are covered by conformance. So what Borg had was actually a framework where tests could be run in multiple modes. Like the test execution was abstracted. So you could actually run them either as unit tests or integration tests. So I think something like that is going to be necessary ultimately for different parts of the system so that we can run tests in sort of synchronous direct unit or integration testing mode, and also run against the real API against a real cluster. So, you know, that's pretty tricky to design, and there will need to be multiple such frameworks, but ultimately we're going to need something like that.
One of the integration framework that we have, there are some limitations to it, but it wasn't that bad to use. Like, we thought it was going to be a huge onus to turn it up, because there weren't any integration tests for the workloads API when we started. It's not perfect, and it's not like we can run an integration in unit mode for the same test. We could invest there. But as a start, like if we started looking at, well, does this test really belong in unit, integration, or E2E, and moving those around, you end up with a surface that might actually look like, okay, well, these are things that we're actually promising to users, and they're black box, and we can call that conformance.
Well, in order to be conformance, they have to run in the E2E framework. They have to run against an existing cluster that was provisioned by whatever distribution. Right. As opposed to like some of the tests we have spin up components as part of the test. That's one issue with the node conformance tests, for example, which is valid, but not as conformance tests.
I want to time check us here real briefly and say we're almost halfway through the meeting, and we've only gotten through a third of our housekeeping.
So the KEP tracking I want to cover quickly. Mainly, there are a ton of KEPs in the dashboard and a ton of issues that have been filed against architecture tracking. And I've looked at almost none of them because I've been focusing on conformance testing. So I think the meta issue there is, what do we want to do about that? I mean, obviously, there should be people other than just me who should be looking at them as well. And that relates to the prioritization topic I added to the agenda coming up.
With
Do all of these KEPs, I think, are we, and I apologize that I haven't been able to put any time into this, are we differentiating between KEPs which are just local to a SIG and don't need SIG architecture coverage versus looking at all KEPs?
We're going to have to prioritize, imagine, given the limited bandwidth. I haven't even done that level of triage.
yeah, the dashboard is for all caps, which I also haven't looked at all, having just finished a bunch of personal stuff.
Because I think the biggest thing is we can say, hey, do you think this needs SIG architecture coverage?
Right. And that's part of the KEP process that we need to evolve. It's like, how and where should SIG architecture get involved? The first thing Jace did is just like chase down the KEPs that were in flight so we could start figuring out that process. And it was pretty messy because some are open PRs and some are merged and things like that. So that flagged the need for more automation to help search those things. Maybe, when a KEP goes to implementable is when a PR is open for that. A few of those have popped up. Maybe that's a point to get involved unless people have explicit concerns get escalated earlier. But yeah, that's stuff that we need to figure out, but someone needs to own figuring that out. And it probably can't be me because I'm focusing on conformance testing.
Yeah, nominally that should be me, probably. It's Caleb, if you're trying to look for the small picture, Brian.
Yeah, not so many people are on the call today. That's great that they don't all fit on one screen. So thank you, Caleb.
There's an option, by the way, to actually show more on a screen, by the way.
How?
It's, we can talk later. Okay. I'll send you the option.
Okay. Yeah, so along the lines of, so please follow up and send email to SIG Architecture about that, Caleb, when you have thoughts on it.
Sounds good.
So the alpha features on stable APIs point, I'm going to move down the agenda because I want to talk about priorities first. So in general, as I think I've mentioned before, I feel that the project is at a point where we need to focus more on stability, and that comes in various flavors. One is prioritizing making the existing functionality and APIs better as opposed to new features. So I propose that SIG architecture in general, but definitely me specifically, to focus on things like conformance testing. Release stability is something I'm very concerned about as well. We're getting a lot of reports from users about bugs and not breakage of backward compatibility and things like that from past several releases. I'd say probably for about the past year. So it might be worth doing like an official, we do postmortems at the time that we cut the .0 release, but I don't know that we've done postmortems of like all the patches that we had to do later. We've had cases where even patch releases broke compatibility. So I think we need to look harder at that. That's related to something I put in the future agenda items list, which is how to move to more secure defaults without continuously breaking users. This is an issue that's come up with some of the patches that have been made. So we don't have time to discuss that now, but I do want to schedule that for a future meeting. I'm pretty sure we shouldn't be doing that in patch releases. And I'm not even sure that there's a sane way to do that in minor releases, but that's worth a discussion to see if we can figure that out. In terms of areas of somewhat new functionality that I want to talk about, I think one of the roles of SIG architecture is to sort of provide technical guidance for the entire project. And it's been a while since I sent out emails telling people what I think they should focus on. And that probably also shouldn't just be me. So I want to get some agreement amongst SIG architecture stakeholders about it. But similar to release bugs and backward compatibility breaks and things like that, I'm concerned about reliability of the system, especially under load or under intensive workloads. I no longer have the ability to monitor GitHub issues, sadly. So I don't know if there's some sort of triage we can do of that to get a better sense of what problems users are having stability-wise, and to direct people to focus more on that. But I feel like there's continues to be a lot of focus on adding shiny new features as opposed to making the core system better. And I want to try to move the needle on that a bit. You know, obviously there are features that are important, like in the security area, and we should think about continuing to prioritize those and how to, like I said, discuss how to do that without being a continual nuisance to users. But I also want to figure out if we can move on some long-standing bugs, frictions, cleanups, architectural improvements and things like that have sort of stagnated for a long time, and SIG Architecture's role in pushing those things across multiple SIGs. So did people have thoughts about whether we should be doing that, how we should be doing that, whether we should come up with some sort of statement of priorities that spans multiple releases or something like that, and work with the SIGs to prioritize those things? I think a lever we do potentially have is in terms of approving APIs and KEPs and things like that, where SIG Architecture is involved. So, any
for
thoughts?
me, the issue of prioritizing cleanup and bug fixing always comes back to, but how do you prevent other people from shoving in their shiny new features anyway?
Right. So along the prevention lines, I'm still convinced that we're never going to have stable releases unless we get development out of Kubernetes master, right? And there are two ways we can do that. One is through multiple repos, and the other is through multiple branches.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that assertion, but I don't want to rat hole here.
Sorry, which assertion?
That the only way to have stable Kubernetes releases is to either move development out of Kubernetes, well, to move development away from Kubernetes master.
Well, so the reason I assert that is because features get half-baked, functionality gets merged, and then it becomes sort of impossible to find and identify and rip out. So there's no effective gate to ensure that what is merged has adequate quality, adequate testing, adequate documentation, and so on.
I agree with that assertion, certainly, but that does not seem to, force the solution. But again, we should chat about that some other time, especially since it relates to threads that, from other conversations we both had or been a part of.
Yeah, I think we're still lacking good data on like Daniel's experience with the feature branch that he's working on for service.
Well, I agree with that.
But I'm just trying to make the point that I think we all got in a room, what is it, a year or two ago, and we're like, yes, stability is the thing. Tim put up that awesome slide with all those big numbers, and we're like, yeah, we made it. But we incurred all sorts of debt getting here, and now we're going to pay it down. And then we still ended up shipping out a whole bunch of features as a community. So
yeah. The only lever we've got is our ability to say no to things. And as the sort of architectural leadership of the project, we're sort of in the best position to say no. But the community is naturally a delegated thing, right? So how do we, or can we, impose our will on other SIGs and say, networking, storage, apps, whatever, thou shalt not merge features? Can we get buy-in across the board on that?
Well, I really think about last time we made some progress. I think there's the problem is maybe it's just still is the communication. I know we did a lot of communication last time. We want to do the stable release, and instead the new feature release. We even proposed like every other release could be the stable release. We fix the backlog, something. So SIG Node actually heard that. We really treat one release as a stable release. I think actually helped the SIG Node that time. And we, I think that everyone well know about that release. We don't want to add some new feature. I remember we only approve one new feature in that release. And most of the time we focus on promote the alpha feature to the beta feature to the GA feature. So I do think that helps. And so if we could do that, and to communicate to the different SIG groups, and we do approve, SIG architecture can approve all those, some SIG want exception, then need go through process and have the exception. That would be good.
My concern there is that time is not a really great metric for this. What happens for a lot of outside contributors is they just take their thing and they treat it like a 6-month dev cycle, and they go away and they don't fix bugs in the interim. They just focus on their thing and they show up at the talk and they push their changes in the talk and nobody works on the tick, right? So we need, if we're gonna do something here, we need concrete metrics.
Joe has got a hand up.
Yeah, so I think this might be echoing what Caleb was trying to say. I think there's the motion of like making sure that the stuff that does go in, even if it is a new feature, is really solid, well-tested, documented. That will naturally slow things down. That'll change the culture around this, and that'll mean that like the destabilizing stuff will naturally tend to happen outside of the core. That's a different motion from actually paying down debt, but I think that that it's necessary to first stop incurring new debt before we actually then start to try and pay down the old debt. And so I think that's the saying no around, like, you know, or at least making sure that we have more process so that there is some pain around KEPs and you know, feature flags and API reviews and that type of thing.
So 2 things.
So Aaron, can you stop presenting? Thank you.
So 1, how many, I think people might want to go back to their SIG and figure out how many beta features they currently have in flight and see how that number fluctuates over time. Like, if the definition of finished and reliable and solid is GA, if we're continuously adding new beta features and new alpha features without taking them all the way and putting that extra 10 to 20% in to take them across the line and call them GA and ship them as stable, then it's going to be hard to have a stable API surface. And then number 2, I think pretty much all the API approvers participate in SIG architecture. So if SIG architecture comes together and says that we're going to hold off on approving API changes until you stabilize your stuff, there's still things you can do. You can still ship features that don't involve changing the API.
But what is the metric for stabilize your stuff? As an API reviewer, I don't know how stable or unstable any random SIG's stuff is. I don't even know how stable or unstable half of my own SIG's stuff is because I don't have great metrics.
To measure the number of V1s versus not V1s, the number of feature gates.
I don't think that,
per,
I mean,
per SIG code.
If that correlates well in your SIG, that's awesome. Like, it doesn't necessarily correlate well.
Is your SIG not using feature gates, or are they just adding crap every?
No, there's,
okay, so we need metrics and criteria. So other people have their hands up.
My proposition was that somebody from SIG Architecture should participate in the next release and be the hand of SIG Architecture saying no and pushing back against features. I know that from a technical perspective, that might appear inadequate and things might still like sneak in, but I think it's the higher level top-down message that we are actually taking this seriously, and going forward, you actually have to convince someone who has real technical depth across the project why this feature is worth including in the release as opposed to something that pays down stability.
To Ken's point, it's not just how many features you have in beta. Like, it's not just like, are you moving them from beta to GA? It's also how many are you moving from alpha to beta? Like, it's the total number of beta features at any one given time.
Yeah, and alpha features.
And alpha features. So maybe we could limit the number of beta features.
That was the implication.
Do we have the ability to say no to things after feature freeze without causing a delayed release? I wasn't even sure we were able to do that.
What do you mean?
I think the suggestion was for the next release, not the upcoming release, but the one after, to get in before the feature freeze timeframe and just knack everything.
Before knacking everything, probably do a review.
There's so many hands.
Joe raised his hand first. Please go, Joe.
So, I mean, the quick comment I want to say is even amongst this group, we need to support each other in terms of saying no. If we rewind several weeks, we had a presentation around a KIP around doing snapshots with persistent volumes. And I pushed back around sort of, does this feature really need to be as part of core? Do we need to accept this? And I felt like I was going out on a limb, and I probably pissed some people off around that. And I was really coming at it from the point of view of like, we need to actually sort of, be very, very thoughtful about this. I don't feel like even amongst this group, we actually are all on the same page around this, because everybody has the priorities for their company, the priorities for their pet feature, and it's difficult. It really is difficult. So,
well, can some folks who looked at that respond to it? I think there are some folks here who did look at that. I think it did provoke some good discussion. Anyone?
Ultimately, didn't put in core.
I know, but I felt like I burned some bridges doing that. And I mean, maybe I'm just being extra sensitive to this, but I felt like I really upset some folks doing that.
I think you had very valid points on that. And so thank you for doing that. I think my impression is the feedback was taken well. David?
Yeah, I think that if you start trying to count stability based on whether something is in beta or alpha or V1, you risk creating a perverse incentive where I can get the count of I'm more stable than everyone else just by choosing to promote my thing, regardless of how stable the actual code behind it is. There is value in keeping something in alpha or beta until you've had experience and feedback. And if we get graded for stability based on how quickly or how many things we have moved to GA or to beta, we are encouraged to not gain that feedback during an alpha and beta stage.
I would argue that maybe, though, if you have an ever number growing of features that are in beta, it could be indicative that you're just perpetually, like, constantly experimenting rather than trying to finish any of those given experiments.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you start measuring it, it will cease to be a useful measurement.
Well, I think one thing is, what David said I think has a lot of truth, but the kind of counter pressure there is, once you ship it to V1, you have to support it basically forever. So I haven't seen a lot of people saying, let's just jump into V1 with this, and then, okay, Dave.
I sit outside of Google, and what I see a lot of is that things that are alpha are treated as though they do not exist because they are not in GKE, because you do not turn on alpha by default. And so I hear a lot of, I need to get it from alpha to beta so that I can see people try it. And I think that that is an example of how we create a perverse incentive to quickly move things from one stage to another without gaining feedback. The claim that you can go from alpha to beta in one release, by the time you decided to go to beta, you haven't had anyone try it other than yourself.
I agree with in general, moving a feature from one stage to the next in back-to-back releases, whether it's alpha to beta or beta to V1, doesn't really make any sense because 0 people will have tried that feature, given how our release cycles work and how long it takes people to pick up and try Kubernetes. With alpha features in particular, the reason they're disabled in GKE is because compatibility can be broken, and
I'm not arguing that. Yes, I'm not arguing that you need to change what you do. I am saying that I feel pressure about moving. I am pressured to move things from alpha to beta quickly because you don't gain experience otherwise.
And we could change our rules about alpha and say you can't break compatibility. That's the alternative.
Or you can live with people who try it in an alpha cluster, which
we do have.
It's been a while, but last I tried for, you had a way to put it. I could use it for a month and it got deleted. So
yes,
Eric.
So I don't agree that you get no testers. I think with alpha and alpha clusters, that you can still have identify someone who's going to give you feedback for consuming the feature, whether it's a customer or a sub vendor or whatever, someone who's building on top of Kubernetes. I also want to say that I don't think it's reasonable to. I don't think Google is the only people who is cautious about using a feature that might break. I think lots of Kubernetes users might want to avoid using a feature that's early, so it's important that we label those. And I also think other projects, don't take, a year to move from an idea to something that's complete. So, but if you're saying it takes 2 quarters to go alpha, beta to V1, you're saying you can't completely deliver something in less than a year, which is not a great place to be.
Clayton.
So I was gonna add to this. Like I'm thinking of 2 examples. So stateful sets was a good example of very early on. We said we want this to sit in alpha long enough that we can be sure that it's not going to eat people's data, and that was 2 releases. And then we moved it to beta and said we're going to sit in beta for 3 or 4 releases until we're sure that it doesn't really eat people's data, and we're really sorry if it happens. That was probably the most deliberate I can think us ever being about setting a life cycle and justifying the time in terms of the feature. And there's always small features. I feel like anything that is in core, we have a perverse incentive to accelerate it to beta, as David was noting, for very good reasons and very bad reasons. Everything that is out of core is not a problem. And by out of core, I mean you can do you can build it as an extension. I feel like what happens is the only alternatives we typically are presenting is out or in. And when we're in, we follow one set of rules. And when it's out, we follow a different set of rules. Could we do a better job of trying to set a time frame when features go alpha that figure out that help to smooth this across the project? Like, it's tough because the SIGs are putting up resources to do this, but like the problem is everyone feels that they don't have enough time to properly review the things that are changing Kubernetes. How do we put incentives in place into the SIGs, into the development process, and into the review process that actually play it out? Because I think Joe usually has to be the bad guy of asking the question, can we slow this down? That's not fair to Joe, because Joe's absolutely 100% correct that we drop massive changes to the fundamentals of Kubernetes that we can then never change, or practically speaking, we can never change. How do we do better at balancing this? What are the concrete things that we're going to do as part of SIG lifecycle that will make this better?
So one thing that Joe and Caleb already did that I liked a lot with the CAP process is building the promotion plan and the graduation criteria into the process of design, right? So when you think about shipping the feature, you should already think about the graduation criteria throughout the life cycle of stability and what your plan is to promote it through the API. Having that at least discussion up front might help the process along a little bit better. I mean, it's not a fix-all, but it's a start. Jordan?
Yeah, we talk about gaining experience with alpha features, and I think we put very little thought into how we're going to gain that experience. So it's kind of this amorphous, well, it's checked in, and if you turn on this gate, you can use it. And then maybe a few people go do that, and we don't hear from anybody, and after a while we kind of think, well, I guess it was okay. Part of graduation criteria should probably be, what is the plan to gather feedback? Like, presumably, if this is an important enough feature to put into core, we have identified stakeholders and users and target people clamoring for this thing. Can we gather names? Can we get like a topic or a list or something and actually actively solicit feedback and put timeframes on it?
So I like that. That's a good idea. I want to point out, are we going to get to Patrick Lang's item about moving the Windows feature to GA in this meeting? Or are we going to
I did want to time check. I think we are not going to get to alpha features on stable APIs. I think there's an email thread which I've not caught up on.
Me neither.
So let's punt that to the email, back to the email thread, and I will try to get to it. But like I said, I'm prioritizing things like conformance tests as opposed to new alpha features. As far as getting Windows to GA, yeah, we could talk about that.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and share this this document that I have linked as well. So just a bit of background here. The Windows work, it's kind of funny how someone had brought up an example of how long it takes to get something from alpha to GA. Well, we're currently at 2+ years right now. So, we started the work with Windows, back in 2016, and that was when, the Windows container support had just sort of materialized. At that point in time, it worked well with Docker, and there was no orchestration story. And so, I basically worked, within the Windows team to help get a lot of those gaps filled, so that way we could do things like networking namespaces and get all that OS functionality that was there to meet, what users were expecting in terms of being able to orchestrate containers and pods in a mixed OS environment. And so now we're at a point where, we're basically trying to, close on stability bugs. We've got PRs open to, get hybrid clusters with Windows and Linux nodes, deployed from kube test, get results on test grids. Like, we've got all these PRs open, which are all part of what I believe is necessary to get to GA, but I haven't been able to find any clear criteria on what it actually means to take a completely new feature like this, from beta to GA. And so I basically just started writing, and that's what this doc I have is. A lot of it has been a discussion around scoping, because one of the things that's different is that Windows it's not Unix, but people do want to use it to orchestrate containers. And so for some of this, I've gone through and clarified, like what kind of features are supported. And we've been evaluating the conformance tests, and we've got a list attached in the doc here of what the current pass rates are. But I basically need to understand, what do I need to do within each of the SIGs to sort of, get this feature approved and over the line to GA. I started this discussion with SIG Node, and they had recommended getting buy-off from both from SIG Node, SIG networking, as well as SIG storage, just so that they sort of understood what our design and capabilities were. And then the other advice I got was, we should also have this discussion with SIG Architecture as well, especially because we need to make some changes to some of the conformance tests, specifically because some of the conformance tests run things that are, like a Linux native command, like, chmod, which is not there on Windows because we've got, a file ACL based model rather than a bit mask. So I guess my main question is, like, who should I work with in SIG Architecture in sort of evaluating these criteria? That way we've got something that, is measurable, where we could say, this is when we're ready to GA.
So Dawn had her hand up.
I just want to add more things, because the SIG Windows actually first collaborate with the SIG Node, because obviously the most on the node side, and then we later extended that collaboration to the network, because there are a lot of also network model, it is totally different. And so that's why we suggest SIG Windows also collaborate with the storage, because there's also the only reason it is because Windows support is the new platform support. It's different from the other things we mentioned earlier. It's the feature support. So this new platform support. So I also want to SIG Architecture. It has the sign on for those kind of things. Kubernetes in the future, we are endorse Windows as the new platform, and at the same time, we want to have like what it is conform test, how we are going to pursue of the Windows related conform test. That is what I just want to add in.
Okay, so I guess there are a couple of issues. One is conformance testing specifically. I think we do need to answer how that should work. It has also come up in for different architectures. For example, ARM in particular, it has come up. So we will need to figure out how to tackle that. ARM is easier because I think the behavior is expected to be the same, and multi-architecture images are maybe sufficient to make that work. What would really help me right now to understand what state that's really in, like looking at the SIG Windows GA plan, it only mentions a couple of features that are not supported. Is that really the full list of things that are different or not supported, or is there such a list somewhere so we can really understand what the delta is?
So I've attempted to do this a couple different times, and as a latecomer to the project, I really can't find any one feature list where I could say, here's the feature list, and then here's check marks of, yes or no, this works, this doesn't work. The closest thing I've been able to do is I've made an attempt to look at the API, and over on the SIG Windows community folder over on the GitHub repo, I've got like some annotations on like, this works, this doesn't work. But I think what probably the best feedback I've had so far is, as part of this process, I need to get some docs together that show what the common pod use cases are and what the common values are for Windows, because you are going to see some things, like different paths for exec commands, different container names, and some things like that. So if you've got a recommended way to frame that, that would be immensely helpful.
Okay, I think there are a few things. Like one thing we could do is identify explicit Linuxisms in the API, and certainly the pod API has a number of those. I just reviewed a test of security context, which had things about UIDs and other things. So if we could go flag explicit Linuxisms.
Okay, and how would I flag those? Should I submit PRs back to the API and like improve the comments there so that the auto-generated doc clarifies this?
Yeah, we should probably come up with an explicit way of tagging those things.
I mean, is the goal, I completely agree with that mission. Is the goal to prepare for a major API revision that would abstract those things out or move them into platform-specific subclauses?
Well,
or
let's
just to know.
Let's just know first. Let's figure out what the scope of the problem is, and then we can think about solutions.
And we do have a few precedents already in the API there. And so if you go and look at the OCI spec, there are cases where, if there are things that are OS dependent, we've got two fields. One will be, Linux, whatever the name of the property is. Another one will be Windows, whatever the property or structure is. And so like one example is, there's like Windows security options and there's Linux security options. They're two different things in the OCI spec. And to date, what I've tried to do is mirror that in the container and pod spec where it's necessary. So that way it's more explicit.
That's probably reasonable. I think in terms of accumulating, fixing comments would be great. Something that, pattern that I liked, I don't know if everybody else feels the same, but I actually really like the API accumulator bug where you have one issue open and you just continue to file comments this thing is wrong and that thing is wrong and this thing should be fixed and that thing is specific. And then I have one place that we can keep track of it. It's not a discussion bug, it's a laundry list.
That's 8190 if people want to look at the example.
We could have the one special for Windows. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, I'm saying specifically like open an issue that says Windows or Kubernetes API issues with respect to Windows, and just start cataloging everything you find with thoughts.
Okay, I'll take a closer look at that one.
Yeah, so that's one category. Another category is like you mentioned, the common pod scenarios, like multiple containers with the same IP address sharing a volume, things like that. Have those things been looked at? Those things work? Do we or don't work? Or general categories of things, like I saw host networking was mentioned, or
we don't support host networking or raising privileges on Windows containers. It's not implemented. They're always isolated. And so like those are things where it's because of the way the platform was designed, those features just won't apply.
Right. Yeah. So there's probably a way we can abstract that in a way that's consistent with things like pod security policy and sandboxing. So we should take a look at that. I think Tim Alclair was on earlier.
Yeah.
You can, Tim, have you looked at that with respect to Windows at all?
We're getting booted here. Sorry.
Okay. So anyway, I think we had a great discussion today. I think we'll have to go back and look over the notes. to distill out action items from the notes and follow up on email with things you feel are unresolved. So thanks everybody for coming. Great turnout today. Good discussion.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks all, and thank you so much for taking notes.